Welcome to the International Online Conference, Creating Stability Within Uncertainty. And with us today is Professor Bamford from the UK. She's currently the Strategic Director of Education and Culture for the City of London. Previously, she was Director of the Education Commission and was, in her background, Professor at the University of Arts, also in London, and was and is recognized locally, meaning in England, and internationally for her work and research in the context of art, education, art as education, and other related subjects. So thank you, Anne, for being with us.
My pleasure.
And maybe you can, beyond my short presentation, maybe you can give a brief understanding where you are in the education flowchart, because I remember you've been in different levels.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to say I probably have done most of the roles on the education flowchart. So I began as a teacher, and I describe myself usually as a teacher. And I've taught both primary and secondary school. I was a teacher of English and a teacher of the arts. And as I say, have taught at all different levels. But my current job is I'm Strategic Director of Education at the City of London, and that covers the schools that the city directly runs, but it also influences a policy direction. So I'm now, you would say, at the policy level, but I also try to be at the very practical level. So I do still go into schools very often. And I think teaching is a little bit like riding a horse, that when you go back into it, you're straight away transported into that experience. So I speak, I guess, from a number of levels, but at my current level is a Strategic Policy Director of Education.
So as we all know, we have a situation, as they say in English. We have a situation. So can you just update us on the current situation in England, in London, in education, because of the coronavirus situation, which is affecting Israel and I'm sure affecting England as well?
Yes, I think it's affecting many countries in the world, and education, I think, has been very front line in terms of its effects. So, schools were some of the first organizations to close. They were also some of the first organizations, certainly in the United Kingdom, to reopen. And so teachers have found themselves very much at the front line of reacting to COVID. And also, obviously, we're dealing with humans. Teaching is a human profession. It's a social profession. And so we also are at the front line of not only the learning and educational needs of the children and the staff in the schools, but also their emotional and well-being needs. So I think at all of those levels, it's been a complicated and difficult time for teachers, and something that they never experienced. So one day the schools were open as usual, the next day they were closed, and teachers had to operate virtually 100% virtually, so they had to be operating via computer lessons. I think it's fair to say that while England the United Kingdom has quite high levels of computers available to children, the pedagogy, the ability of teachers to actually work for that to promote learning was a lot different than the availability of the physical machine. So straight away we went from face-to-face to virtual. And then in coming back to school, we have had some children coming back before the holidays. We're now on school holidays at the moment. And it's been a really complicated time because they've had to come back in what are described as bubbles, small groups, very unusual situations, only some children coming back, not all the children coming back, having to adjust the school environment. So the schools resemble more like a hospital than they do a school. They're very, you can't have things on the wall. There's no softness in the building fabrics, the use of the building. So it's been very frontline and very, difficult on a lot of levels. The teachers have responded brilliantly. So they've been very, that they miss the children, they miss their job, and they're really keen, to do it, but to make sure that it's done safely. So it's been a complicated time, I think.
we've been in different OECD's events, and at least in the last few years, the OECD in the context of education has emphasized not only the grades versus the PISA and the numbers, but also competencies and skills. And I know you've been involved, or still is, in a project in the city of London called I call it the Fusion Project. and so maybe I wonder if you can say a little bit, and also, is it still valid because of the corona or despite of the corona, or we should delete the Fusion Project? What do you think?
Well, it's almost scary because several years ago, we realized that there was a growing disconnect between the world of work and the needs of business, what was largely happening within the schools, and what needed to happen in terms of the future of learning. So we began what we called the Fusion Project. It's called Fusion. The reason we used the word fusion, which it's a word in English that means a lot, but also has a quite unusual meaning, because it's very much, it comes from the sciences, but it means it's about fusing or bringing things together. And what we said is, in the future and now, you're going to need to have a whole lot of different skills that you can bring together in different contexts. And we've been supporting global meetings of people who are from all walks of life, not just from the education sector, who are keen to do this, but we've also began in very practical ways to change the curriculum in schools to make it much more orientated towards getting these fusion skills. We don't like calling them, for example, soft skills, because it implies they're very easy to get. In fact, they're quite complex to get and to get them well. But when we started the process, we identified a number of disruptions that could happen in our society that means that this work had to happen even sooner. And we identified 3 top disruptions, and they were changes in the world of work, influence of technology, and a major health issue. The 4th one was an environmental issue. Well, we've had those things, and we've seen those operate over the last few months in ways that we could have never dreamt about when we predicted those potential changes. And the fusion skills work was important 12 months ago, but it's even more important now, because we're seeing, for example, large numbers of 16 to 25-year-olds who have very suddenly been thrown into a situation of unlikely to get jobs, challenges with their further study, what's the value of that's continued study. They've been out of school for 6 months. You know, the importance of that fusion work has grown even more. And fusion are a set of skills that you can apply to whatever purpose you need to apply them for. And people that have been able to do well during this very unusual time are people who have got very strong fusion skills. So we're pursuing the work with even more energy and more enthusiasm, and it's even more important that your curriculum in your schools focuses on the development of those broad fusion skills.
So in the context of this conference, this conference, Stability Within Uncertainty, named 4 competencies decided for that conference. And it was flexibility, surrender, which I would translate as acceptance, presence, and initiative, which you can translate as a creative response.
Yeah.
So I wonder, even though you are in the UK and we are in Israel, but you have enough background internationally, locally, and so your experience is over years and in many places, and on different levels of education, kind of a system, different layers. If you can maybe suggest, if you have any suggestion for a teacher, in a few weeks, school is beginning with uncertainty for sure. For certain, there's uncertainty.
Yes, that's it.
and obviously, as teachers, we want to do the best we can. And sometimes, and we may not even meet the students face to face, and we may not always be in a community of learners because of the long distance needed. Any suggestions for the teacher to maintain stability, to cope well, to teach well, and to recruit somehow flexibility, acceptance, presence, and creativity, which seems to be undoable. I mean, we wish, but we make it doable.
I mean, I think it's really interesting that the ones that you've identified, because we have done a lot of research, and we list 12 fusion skills that are the key skills that people need, because there are many skills, but we wanted to make a sort of manageable number that could be the focus of curriculum. So we identified 12, and there's many overlaps with what you've said. So for example, flexibility is one of the fusion skills. And I think that's a key thing in coping with the transition back to children being in school, is you're going to need to be flexible in your curriculum, flexible in your planning, flexible in your timetable, flexible in the spaces where you're going to teach the children, where you're going to have learning happening. You talk about initiative. In the fusion skills, we talk about innovation and creativity and initiative. So initiative is specifically mentioned, which is that capacity to respond differently and to not wait for somebody to tell you the answer. You're going to have to be out there forming the answer as you go along and sharing it, hopefully, because the great thing is that we're in this together, you know. And I think if I think of some positives that have happened during this time, is one of the real positives has been around greater sharing. We've had businesses sharing software and sharing content, and we've had schools sharing with each other and teachers sharing materials and so on. So I think that initiative and sharing is really important. The other thing I would say is that creativity has actually flourished in some ways during this time, because children have been actually getting able to, in a virtual learning environment, spend longer really exploring things they're interested in. And so if I'm passionate about dinosaurs, I can really be creative and responsive in what I do about dinosaurs. I've been collecting some imagery from lockdown, and some of it is the children's virtual work, and it's very creative, very deep and responsive. So I think there are some things where perhaps children have had more time to go in depth and to actually be more creative. I think in terms of a few really practical points, is one of the things that worries me is if we think that teachers can go back to just being normal, in terms of let's just get back to the normal situation, without acknowledging what parents and children have done during this time, and allowing the children. I think one of the really practical things I've said to the schools in London is, please allow the first couple of weeks for children to talk with you about what they've been doing, like actually timetable time to tell you each other what you've been doing, because the number one fusion skill is oral communication, and it's really important that they have time to talk, because also through that talk we'll learn more about what they've been learning about, but we'll also hear some of their issues that they might have in terms of their well-being or their feelings of safety and security and their concerns and the things they're worried about. So I think that's a really key thing, is having time. And also that when school comes back, some of the, and you'd be aware of this, Nimrod, because of our conversations at the OECD level, people say, well, they've missed numeracy and they've missed literacy, and we have to really give extra mathematics and extra, you know. And I think we have to be really careful that when children come back, they still have a very balanced and broad curriculum, because I think there's a real danger that if we say, oh, they've missed all these maths concepts, let's just do lots and lots of this or that, what can happen is the curriculum becomes very narrow and the children will be bored and disengaged. And they've had this experience of being able to follow their own interests for several months of learning, and then to push them back into a very narrow curriculum, I think, is a real worry. So my suggestion is the first few weeks, provide lots of opportunities for talk, and then make sure that your recovery curriculum is very broad and very open. That will give you flexibility, but it will also make sure that you see where the children have developed strengths and where there might be some gaps. Don't Don't narrow the curriculum to try and sort of quickly, let's try and force you to catch up very, very quickly. Children will catch up if they're given that broad curriculum. So they're the two very practical suggestions. And wash your hands.
Thank you. You just told me beforehand that maybe you can just kind of share with the audience about the how close can we get if we are in school and social distancing is supposedly demanded. It's not recommended, it's demanded. What do you see? Well, what's really able to happen?
Yeah, I think a real difficulty is, my story I was relating is there's sometimes a problem between what policymakers tell us and the realities of our classroom situation. I'm lucky because although I'm in policy, I'm very much a teacher. So I have a real understanding of the classroom. And I was telling the story that it was said in the policy in England that children have to keep 2 meters apart, and that when children are moving down the corridor, you have to have one group going one way and another group going the other way. And I said, I don't know about schools in Israel, but I don't think any of my schools, certainly in London, have at least a 4 meter wide corridor. In fact, they're lucky if they have a corridor that's like 1.5 meters maybe. And so I was saying, here you face these practical issues. So our children, I think it's going to be quite similar to how it will be for you in Israel. We have had children coming back. So children started to return to school in June and July. Some children, especially our vulnerable children, were allowed to come to school the whole time. So they've been coming to school, but in very, very small numbers. And when we started to open the schools before the holidays, parents were very reluctant to send their children. I think there's a lot of nervousness amongst parents about the safety of their children. And we saw, particularly among certain ethnic groups, because they do have higher rates of COVID infection, which can, cause considerable worry. And sometimes the health messages have been very confusing to families. And so there's a lot of nervousness. All children are supposed to come back in September. So we're supposed to have 100% of children in the school. And in fact, parents are going to be fined if they don't send their children back. And yet the schools have to manage teaching the children in bubbles. So you have a bubble is now going to be a class size bubble, and the teacher must stay with that class. In secondary school, so it could be a whole year group in a bubble, so 150 or 180 children, a big bubble. And you can't mix any of the materials, you can't mix any of the teachers. So the teachers are also in the bubble. And it said if any 2 people in that bubble get confirmed COVID cases, then the whole bubble has to go back into remote learning for at least 14 days. So we have to be somehow managing to have some children in the school and some children virtual, which is a challenge because teachers have done a great job by and large of doing virtual teaching, but how do you manage doing face-to-face teaching and virtual teaching? So it's very difficult, and you have practical things as well. So, even every child needs their own resources. You can't share books and pencils and paper. You have to provide it for each child. So even if a library book comes in, it has to have 72 hours in a quarantine before the next child can use the same library book. You can't have any soft material in the school, so you can't have cushions or chairs or bean bags or reading corners. So the children are coming back to a very different school and classroom than they used to. Only this week, the rule has come in that we all need to wear masks. So we don't know how little children will react to seeing a teacher wearing, with a face mask on. I think we're going to be trying to have very creative face masks. I have a leopard skin one so that it looks a bit friendly to children, because this is all different for children. And I think, when we had some children coming back, we found, for example, our secondary school children were very quiet, very not, You know, if you've ever had children of your own and they get sick, you long for them being naughty again, because it means when they're naughty again, they're starting to feel better again, you know, when they're all sort of lying still and can't even have the energy to be naughty. And I sort of almost longed for my teenage children in the school to start to be naughty again, because it's like, then it means they're warming up again. At the moment, they're just very quiet because they're distanced away from each other. They can't talk. It's a funny situation.
We need to close. Unfortunately, we could speak much more, but for now, thank you for being with us and for sharing and for participating in this event. And all the best to you and to all of us in these uncertain times.
Just remember, the teachers are doing a marvelous job. It's a really special that they are going to be right at the front line of helping those children to flourish. And I'm sure the teachers will miss. There were a lot of tears when the children came back because the teachers missed them. So take care, everybody, and stay healthy, and good luck with your new school year.